Part 3, Chapter 53. We are skipping over 53.4 and moving into 53.5, where we're looking at things that influence population growth and how those things tend to be density dependent. So to start with, we should clarify what the difference between density dependent and density independent occurrences are. Density dependent occurrences are things that happen that cause death rates to rise as the population increases in size. Density independent occurrences have no effect on either the birth rate or the death rate as population increases in size. So let's take a look at some things that would be classified as density dependent. Examples include competition for resources. You can think about it like this. If I were to put a small personal pan pizza on my front table and you guys were trapped in my room for 3 days and starved and there's 20 of you, how many of you are not going to get food? Well, I can imagine what would happen, and it'd be fun to watch actually, as elbows are getting thrown and bodies are getting shoved and people getting picked up and tossed. There'd be heavy competition for that little piece of pizza. But if I put 30 large pizzas on my counters and said, help yourselves, some of you are going to rush up for sure and hoard a bunch of pizza. And some of you are going to play the cool card and just kind of hang back and let for the chaos to calm down, knowing that there's going to be plenty of that pizza, or in this case resource, for you once the pandemonium dies out of it. So competition, it only really exists when there's limited or when there's a large population. Predation would be another one. Predators depend on a food source. Take away that food source and predators go down. Intrinsic factors. These are built-in mechanisms, if you will, where certain organisms will literally stop reproducing when populations get to be of a certain size. So they kind of self-control, and it's kind of like a built-in mechanism that just works, and that's an intrinsic factor. Territoriality. Once again, if the population is large, you got to be a little bit more pushy for your space. And then disease, when populations are large, it's easier for disease to spread from one person to the next. Picture a person sneezing right next to you versus 10 feet away from you, if there's that space. So population dynamics is the fluctuation or change from year to year or place to place of a population. And it can once again be influenced by both those biotic and abiotic factors. What we need to be aware of commercially is certain species, like maybe fish, that populations might decrease as a result of water conditions, which would be abiotic, or maybe a decrease in a food source, which would be biotic, or maybe an increase in predator, which would be biotic, and that would commercially impact us because we rely on those organisms for food and for money. One mechanism of population dynamics would be stability and fluctuation of populations. What we see right here is called a predator-prey graph, and it charts the population size of a prey population relative to a predator population. So notice over here the wolves are actually graphed on this y-axis and the moose are actually graphed on this y-axis. What tends to happen is as predator populations rise, prey populations decrease, and as prey populations increase, predator populations increase. So they do directly affect one another, which, as interesting as this may sound, they are stable populations, but they are fluctuating on a year-to-year basis. Another area of population dynamics would be cycles, such as reproductive cycles of snowshoe hares, which this might look like a predator-prey graph, and I suppose it is, but that's not what we're actually looking at. We're looking at these spikes in the snowshoe hare population. Snowshoe hares, what we're getting at with the population cycles is for whatever reason these rabbits have a boom every 10 years or so where they just crank out a ton of offspring, more so than normal. And it's quite cyclical. It happens about once every 10 years like clockwork. These reproductive cycles are called population cycles, and they do keep a dynamic population. And our last section is looking at the human population and its pattern of growth, which has been exponential, as we can see by this graph here, but it has slowed down, which, looking at this graph, it's kind of scary. When we look right around here, which was 1650 roughly, so like 350 years ago, the population on the entire planet was only 500 million individuals. Over the course of the more recent 350 years, it's now at about 7 billion people. And by the year 2050, it's estimated that it will be in excess of 10 billion people. So how much longer can our planet continue to sustain this type of growth? Surely we got to run out of resources. I mean, it almost seems like we already are for the human population. But ultimately, what has allowed for this rapid influx of the human population? This was 1650. This is today. This is every year prior to 1650. Notice how long it took for our population to all of a sudden get this J-shaped boom. Well, think about what started to happen around this time. You know, people started to live longer, which would allow us to have a larger population. Babies were able to be born more successfully. What allowed that? Well, largely improved medicinal techniques and antibiotics were developed that allowed us to survive better than previous. Even oddly enough, 120 years ago or so, if you broke your femur, which is the big bone in your thigh, you had a pretty solid chance at dying because you'd bleed to death. Now you break your femur, it's just a lot of pain and a few days in the hospital, but you're not in really any danger. So it's amazing what just 100 years can make on terms of quality of life and our ability to survive what used to be catastrophic. Another thing that has allowed the population to slow down a little bit is what's called the demographic transition. And this is where a certain region or part of the planet that has a high birth rate as well as a high death rate changes to a low birth rate and a low death rate. When we have a low birth rate and a low death rate, we tend to have a stable population, not really growing anymore. But when there's a high birth rate and a high death rate, we're having a growing population. And this is highly associated with healthcare and education. There are still areas of our planet where there's high birth and high death rates going on. So they're not completing the demographic transition as of right now, whereas we are still in the mix of moving towards a completed demographic transition. Italy, as we'll come to see in a few slides here, is one region that has completed the demographic transition. They are no longer a growing population. So next up, we're looking at the age structure of individuals, which will look similar to something we saw previously in one of the tables. It is a graph, more or less, that shows how many individuals of a population exist at each age bracket. And here's 3 examples of an age structure diagram. This shows us the percent of a population, and on one side of the solid line we have females, and on the other side we have males. More or less what this shows us is that out of the entire population here in the United States, roughly 3.8% of the population is a male between the ages of 0 and 4. And that roughly 4% of the population is a male between the ages of 40 and 44. Well, looking at the United States, we are very thick down here, but then it tapers off right here. And recall Italy, I said no growth. That's because it's more uniform as we move from top to bottom, whereas the States, it starts out fat, stays fat, and tapers off. Afghanistan is one that's really just starting the demographic transition. They have a high birth rate, high death rate, and as we can see, 8 plus 8, we'll just round that and say 8. We'll say that's 17. 17% of the population is a child between the ages of 0 and 4. Another large portion of the graph is still a child between the ages of 5 and 9. So another large chunk of the population is a child between the ages of 10 and 14. So most of the population is really people that are 29 years or younger, and very, very few people that are in the older years of life. And if you think about why that might be, education and healthcare, it does make sense. But once again, low birth rate equals low children, low death rate equals a thicker area of this part of the graph, and ultimately a fatter middle region. This would be a completed demographic transition. Now, the global carrying capacity. This is very difficult to estimate because there's so many variables that we need to consider. You know, one of the big ones really comes down to money. You know, that if you have money, you can buy food, and if you don't have money, you have to really struggle to get food. Not saying that you can't do it, it's just a heck of a lot more difficult. And if you think about the impoverished countries that have very little food, they're also very, very poor. Other variables that should be considered, you know, resources, just in general, shelter, space, a lot of things to consider with global carrying capacity. So there's all sorts of estimates from all sorts of different people, and it's really difficult to pinpoint which one is the most accurate. One thing that we should consider, though, is the ecological footprint in regards to all people, which is defined as the amount of land and water required for each person, city, or nation, depending on what scale you're looking at, to produce all the resources necessary to survive and to absorb all the waste it generates. So the ecological footprint, it does vary from country to country, but not surprisingly, it is pretty much the worst in North America because we are huge consumers. So looking at the deep red, that's about as bad as you can possibly get. And looking at the white, that's about as small of an ecological footprint as you can possibly have. And it makes sense, you know, with Americans especially, bigger's better, right? So you got to have the most land and the largest house, meaning you need to put in the most electricity to use the most of that resource, which means you have to then buy a ton of furniture for rooms that you're probably never going to use, and then you have to throw all that trash away, and then you have to water those big, big lawns. Yeah, we're absolute hogs. And this isn't to say that Americans are the only ones to blame by any means, but we do definitely have some of the largest ecological footprints on the globe. You know, even take into consideration when you buy, you know, what the latest iPhone you had, the iPods, whatever. You know, you pulled out one tiny little device. How many individual pieces of trash did you end up throwing out, including every little piece of plastic, every little twist tie, every piece of cardboard, every piece of styrofoam? It doesn't seem like it's a lot, but it really is. There was something I was watching on YouTube maybe a year or two ago about purchasing one Barbie, and you open up the package and get one Barbie, but you get 30 individual pieces of trash from one Barbie. It's kind of remarkable. You get one Barbie, but you put off a lot of trash. Yeah, we got a big ecological footprint here. This concludes chapter 53. So I will talk to you guys in chapter 54.